My parents drove 9 hours to my office carrying a notarized demand letter. Interesting thing about family betrayal. The people who steal from you rarely think of themselves as thieves. They think of themselves as owed. I was reviewing a trust dispute when my assistant knocked on my office door. Tuesday. 4:47 p.m. K Street. 14th floor. Washington, D.C. And honestly? The irony almost made me laugh. Because the client sitting open on my desk was suing her mother for draining an education trust. $83,000. Gone. Spent on a timeshare in Cabo. Interesting thing about specialization. Sometimes people become experts in the exact wounds they survived privately. My assistant Nadia didn't wait for permission before opening the door. That's how I knew something was wrong. Nadia always waits. Tony. Pause. There's a couple downstairs. Another pause. They say they're your parents. Interesting, honestly. Because certain sentences instantly collapse time inside your body. I set my fountain pen down carefully. No shaking hands. No panic. Just pressure. Old pressure. The kind that settles behind your ribs when your nervous system remembers someone before your brain does. How long? Nadia glanced toward the hallway. They've been here since 7 this morning. 7 hours. Interesting thing about people rehearsing emotional manipulation. They always arrive early enough to build momentum before the conversation starts. They drove from Asheville overnight. Pause. They brought paperwork. There it was. Of course they did. Because my parents never arrived emotionally. They arrived strategically. Interesting, honestly. Because families built around control eventually start treating legal documents like emotional weapons. I touched the silver pocket watch beneath my collar automatically. Warm against my skin. Hamilton. Hunter case. Engraved with 2 words I'd memorized at 10 years old. Make it count. My grandfather Walter gave it to me Christmas morning in 2002. My mother hated it instantly. Interesting thing about gifts from people who truly see you. Controlling family members recognize the danger immediately. It's a man's watch, my mother said loud enough for everyone. Walter sipped coffee calmly. It belongs to whoever earns it. He never looked at her while saying it. That was Walter's style. Quiet precision. The kind of man who already finished the argument internally before anyone else realized one had started. Nadia closed the office door behind her softly. You want me to send them away? Simple question. Dangerous question. Because 7 years earlier? I probably would have said yes. But not now. Interesting, honestly. Because time eventually transforms fear into preparation if you survive long enough. No. Pause. Put them in conference room B. Nadia studied my face carefully. You okay? I considered the question honestly. Then answered. I will be. Not confidence. Memory. Huge difference. Because I had been waiting for this exact afternoon for 7 years and 3 months. I count it precisely because it started February 2019. The week my mother legally disowned me at my grandfather's funeral. Interesting thing about humiliation. Your body remembers exact dates long after your heart stops reacting emotionally. I stood and walked toward the elevator lobby. Past analysts. Past glass offices. Past Greg Whitford's office with the door half open and market reports glowing across dual monitors. Greg glanced up once. Didn't ask questions. Good managers know when silence is professionalism. I stopped near the frosted glass overlooking reception. Looked through the seam carefully. And there they were. Margaret Offit. Black wool cardigan. Bone buttons. Perfect posture. The same careful elegance she used whenever she planned to ruin someone politely. Interesting, honestly. Because dangerous women rarely look dangerous publicly. My father sat beside her. Smaller than I remembered. Hair completely white now. Hands folded too tightly. Eyes fixed on the carpet. And sitting on my mother's lap. A manila envelope with a red string closure. Notary seal visible through the corner. Of course. Notarized. Because my mother loved official humiliation. The first time she used a notary against me. I was 27 years old standing inside an Episcopal church reception hall after my grandfather's burial. 43 guests. Coffee urns. Ham sandwiches. And my mother standing beside a hired notary reading aloud from a document titled Declaration of Estrangement. Interesting thing about narcissistic parents. They often mistake public cruelty for moral clarity. You are not my daughter anymore. 8 words. That's all it took. The notary stamped the paper while people stared at the floor. My father signed beneath her. And honestly, that moment changed my life more than losing the trust money ever did. Because money creates damage. But public rejection creates structure. Interesting, honestly. Because once someone legally removes you from their emotional world, you finally stop negotiating for love inside it. I walked back toward my office slowly. Not rushing. Not hiding. Just thinking. My desk waited exactly as I left it. Clean legal pad. Fountain pen. Client file. And beside my monitor, the blue folder. Plain label. One word written in block letters. Walter. Interesting thing about prepared people. We rarely survive toxic families accidentally. The folder contained 3 documents. The 2019 Declaration of Estrangement. My grandfather's final handwritten letter. And 8 trust withdrawal statements signed by my parents between 2008 and 2016. Total taken. $418,000. My college trust. My future. My inheritance. Gone. Interesting, honestly. Because the people who preach family doesn't keep score usually benefit most from nobody counting. I opened the folder carefully. Not because I needed to review anything. Because I needed to remember exactly who I was before walking into that room. The first withdrawal. March 2008. $46,000. Signed by Philip and Margaret Offit. Second withdrawal. August 2010. $280,000. Lake House down payment. Third. $85,000 in 2014. Kitchen renovation. Dock repairs. A boat that later burned in an engine fire. Interesting thing about stolen money. People spend it emotionally faster than financially. I touched the yellowed envelope next. Walter's handwriting shaking across the front. Postmarked January 28, 2019. 12 days before he died. Inside. One sentence mattered more than all the others. They'll come for you eventually. Pause. When they do. Another pause. Make it count. I closed the folder. Exhaled once slowly. Then picked it up beneath my arm and walked toward conference room B. Because honestly, my parents thought they drove 9 hours to ask their daughter for money. What they actually did was schedule an appointment with the attorney who spent 7 years preparing for them. Conference room B always felt colder after 5 o'clock. Interesting thing about corporate buildings. They become confession booths once most people go home. The glass walls reflected late afternoon sunlight across the cherrywood table while my parents sat waiting exactly where I expected them to. My mother facing the window. Control position. My father beside her. Smaller somehow. Quieter. Like years of avoiding conflict had physically compressed him. Interesting, honestly. Because passive people don't stay neutral forever. Eventually silence reshapes their entire body. Margaret stood the second I entered. Arms lifting slightly. The beginning of a hug. Not a real one. A strategic one. I sidestepped it gently and offered my hand instead. Interesting thing about boundaries. Sometimes the smallest refusals communicate the most. Her arms dropped immediately. Tiny crack. Huge message received. Tony. Pause. You look exhausted. There it was. Opening tactic. Concern first. Control second. My mother always softened people before asking them to surrender. It's been a busy week. I sat across from them deliberately. Distance matters in negotiations. Eye lines matter. Tables matter. Interesting, honestly. Because emotionally manipulative people rely heavily on physical rhythm. Proximity. Momentum. Interruption. I removed a fountain pen from my jacket pocket. Set it beside the folder. My mother noticed the folder instantly. Of course she did. Margaret noticed leverage before emotion every single time. She untied the red string around the manila envelope slowly. Theatrically slow. Like she was opening church records instead of asking her estranged daughter for money. Interesting thing about manipulative people. They often ritualize paperwork to make unethical things feel legitimate. She slid 3 notarized pages across the table. Toward me. Toward the attorney she accidentally created. We had this prepared by our lawyer in Asheville. Lawyer. Not advisor. Not friend. Lawyer. Interesting, honestly. Because deep down, my mother understood exactly what this meeting really was. I read the document carefully. Not because I needed time. Because silence destabilizes rehearsed people. Page 1. Financial hardship. Page 2. Lake house foreclosure. $412,000 owed. Auction scheduled July 15th. Page 3. The actual request. $300,000 transferred into their joint account no later than July 8th. Blank signature line waiting beneath my printed name. Interesting thing about entitlement. People eventually start drafting obedience before receiving consent. I read it twice. Centered the pages neatly on the table. And let the silence breathe. 7 seconds. 10. 15. My mother cracked first. We sacrificed everything for you, Tony. Pause. You owe us. There it was. Not apology. Debt collection. Interesting, honestly. Because toxic parents often frame raising children like unpaid labor they expect reimbursed later. I folded my hands calmly. May I ask a clarifying question? Margaret blinked slightly. The word choice bothered her. Clarifying. Professional. Not emotional. Not daughter language. Attorney language. Of course, sweetheart. Sweetheart. Interesting thing about emotionally manipulative mothers. They return to childhood nicknames whenever adult accountability enters the room. Where's Doug? My half-brother's name landed like dropped silverware. My father looked up instantly. Margaret's jaw tightened. Interesting, honestly. Because every dysfunctional family has one child they protect and one child they invoice emotionally. Doug's situation in Tampa is complicated right now. Translation. Doug said no. He co-signed the lake house originally, didn't he? That was temporary. Phil finally moved slightly. Tiny movement. Huge tension. Margaret. Soft warning. Barely audible. She turned toward him immediately. Sharp look. Years of practice control compressed into one glance. Interesting thing about long marriages built around dominance. Entire conversations happened silently across eye contact. He removed himself from the loan in 2024, she said quickly. Interesting. Because I already knew that. I'd been tracking the property title for 6 months. Foreclosure notices. Equity loan filings. Refinancing attempts. All public records. Interesting honestly. Because children raised inside unstable homes often become adults who prepare quietly long before danger arrives. I see. I picked up my pen. Didn't write anything. Just held it. Then finally. Before I answer your request. Pause. I need to revisit 2017. Both of them went still immediately. Not confused. Recognizing. Huge difference. Interesting thing about guilty people. They remember exact years faster than innocent ones do. In August 2017. Pause. I visited First Union Trust. My father's face drained instantly. Margaret remained still. Too still. Professional manipulators freeze when calculating. I learned the Walter Offutt Family Trust originally held $480,000. Another pause. Projected growth by 2017 should have placed the balance near $1.4 million. Silence. My actual balance was $41,000. Interesting honestly. Because some numbers are so devastating they change the air pressure inside a room. Phil closed his eyes immediately. Margaret didn't move. Not yet. I continued calmly. 8 withdrawals between 2008 and 2016. Signed by Philip and Margaret Offutt. I opened the blue folder carefully. Removed the highlighted statements. Placed them gently beside the bailout letter. 2 stacks now. Their request. Their history. Interesting thing about evidence. It removes oxygen from manipulation extremely quickly. Margaret recovered first. Tony. Pause. Your father and I managed that money for the family. Managed. Interesting word choice. Not borrowed. Not used. Managed. Interesting honestly. Because guilty people carefully select verbs that reduce criminality emotionally. You took $418,000. It wasn't stealing. Another tiny crack. Huge truth underneath it. We sacrificed for this family for decades. There it is again. Margaret frowned. What? The idea that parenting creates financial ownership over your child later. Interesting thing about healthy families. They don't send invoices for childhood. Phil finally spoke. Quietly. We always meant to put it back. That sentence changed the room completely. Because it wasn't denial. It was confession. Interesting honestly. Because the first honest sentence inside a dysfunctional family usually sounds devastatingly small. Margaret turned sharply toward him. Philip. Warning tone now. Danger entering her voice. But my father kept talking anyway. The $280,000 in 2010. Pause. That bought the lake house. Silence. The $85,000 in 2014. Another pause. That renovated it. His hands started shaking visibly. The boat. Pause. The dock. Another pause. All of it. Interesting thing about buried guilt. Eventually it stops asking permission before surfacing. Margaret stood abruptly. Chair striking the credenza behind her. Stop talking. Phil didn't stop. Not this time. The boat caught fire in 2014. My father stared at the table while speaking. We used the insurance money on credit cards. Another pause. I kept thinking we'd fix it before you noticed. Interesting, honestly. Because weak people rarely believe they're villains. They believe they still have time to undo what they've done. I said nothing. Didn't interrupt. Didn't comfort him. Huge difference. Because accountability without interruption is sometimes the cruelest mirror possible. Phil finally looked directly at me. Eyes red now. I knew your grandfather figured it out before he died. Silence. I still never called him. Interesting thing about regret. The heaviest part usually isn't what people did. It's the moment they realized they still chose silence afterward. The boat caught fire in 2014. My father stared at the conference table while speaking. We used the insurance money on credit cards. Another pause. I kept thinking we'd fix it before you noticed. Interesting thing about regret. The heaviest part usually isn't what people did. It's the moment they realized they still chose silence afterward. Conference room B stayed completely still after that. No traffic noise. No elevator chimes. Just my father breathing unevenly while 7 years of buried truth finally dragged itself into the light. Interesting, honestly. Because dysfunctional families survive through silence long before they survive through love. My mother recovered first. Of course she did. Margaret Offit treated emotional collapse the way CEOs treat bad press. Containment first. Humanity later. Tony. Pause. Your father is overwhelmed. Interesting phrase. Because manipulative people always frame confession as instability once truth becomes dangerous. He's confessing. Simple sentence. Sharp sentence. The kind attorneys use because precision cuts cleaner than emotion. Margaret straightened slowly. Bone-white fingers smoothing the edge of her cardigan. Tiny control ritual. Huge tell. You have no idea what it cost us to raise you. There it was again. The invoice. Interesting, honestly. Because toxic parents convert childhood into debt the second accountability appears. You lived in private schools. You had tutors. Your grandfather expected perfection. And somehow that justified taking my trust? Margaret's jaw tightened instantly. Not anger. Exposure. Huge difference. Because suddenly she heard herself the way outsiders would. I opened Walter's final letter carefully. Yellow paper. Fold lines worn soft from years inside the folder. My grandfather's handwriting shaky but precise. I slid it across the table toward them. Neither touched it immediately. Interesting thing about guilt. People recognize dangerous truth before reading a single word. Read the highlighted section. Phil picked it up first. Hands trembling visibly now. Margaret stayed standing. Still calculating. Always calculating. Then my father read aloud quietly. Margaret believes inheritance is reimbursement for motherhood. Silence. Huge silence. Because dead men tell the truth differently. No fear. No consequences left. Just honesty. Interesting, honestly. Because sometimes the only person willing to name a toxic family dynamic is the one already dying. Phil swallowed hard. Continued reading. If Tony ever discovers the withdrawals. Pause. She must never confuse guilt with obligation. My mother finally moved then. Sharp movement. Reached for the paper. Walter always exaggerated. Interesting thing about narcissistic people. They attack credibility immediately once facts become undeniable. I leaned back slowly in my chair. No. Pause. He documented. That landed harder. Because documentation survives emotion. Dates. Statements. Signatures. Objective reality. Interesting honestly. Because manipulative people depend heavily on memory becoming blurry over time. Margaret sat again carefully. First sign she understood control was slipping. Then came the pivot. The dangerous pivot. Tears. Perfectly timed tears. Interesting thing about practiced emotional manipulators. They weaponize vulnerability the second dominance stops working. I was drowning. Voice cracking softly now. Your father was drinking. The bills never stopped. Doug left. Another tear. And you. Pause. You were always so capable. There it was. The justification beneath everything. Competence. My usefulness became permission. Interesting honestly. Because strong children inside dysfunctional families eventually get punished by becoming the emotional emergency fund. You could have asked me. Margaret laughed once bitterly through tears. With what dignity? Interesting question. Because dignity apparently mattered only after stealing failed. You hosted parties at the lake house with my inheritance. Silence. You bought a boat. Another silence. You legally disowned me at Grandpa's funeral. Interesting thing about accountability. Stacking truths calmly often destroys denial faster than yelling ever could. Phil covered his face briefly with one shaking hand. And honestly? That hurt more than my mother crying. Because my father finally looked exactly like what he was. A man who surrendered morality one quiet compromise at a time. Interesting honestly. Because weak people rarely destroy families dramatically. They destroy them incrementally. One silence. One signature. One avoided conversation at a time. Margaret wiped beneath her eyes carefully. Then finally. We came because we're losing the house. Not apology. Need. Huge difference. The bank scheduled foreclosure. The lake house goes next month. Pause. We have nowhere else. Interesting thing about consequences. They sound incredibly unfair to the people who postponed them longest. I looked at the notarized demand letter again. $300,000. Requested from the daughter they publicly erased 7 years earlier. The irony felt almost mathematical. You disowned me legally. Margaret inhaled sharply. That was emotional. Interesting honestly. Because manipulative people always downgrade cruelty after needing help from the person they harmed. You hired a notary. Silence. You distributed copies. Another silence. You told 43 people I wasn't your daughter anymore. Phil whispered. She made me sign it. Margaret turned toward him instantly. Absolute fury now. Tiny woman. Massive rage. Interesting thing about controlling people. They panic hardest once their supporting witnesses stop cooperating publicly. You agreed with me. Phil looked exhausted suddenly. Soul exhausted. No. Pause. I surrendered. That sentence changed the room completely. Because for the first time, my father stopped describing passivity like innocence. Interesting honestly. Because accountability begins exactly when people stop confusing weakness with goodness. I closed the blue folder slowly. Centered both hands on top of it. Then finally said the sentence I rehearsed for 7 years. I'm not giving you $300,000. Silence. No dramatic gasp. No yelling. Just impact. Heavy impact. Because deep down, they both walked into that room believing obligation still controlled me. Interesting thing about healing. Eventually your nervous system stops confusing guilt with responsibility. Margaret's face hardened immediately. Tears gone now. Performance over. So that's it? Pause. You're abandoning your family? There it was. Final tactic. Moral inversion. Interesting, honestly. Because toxic parents almost always accuse you of the exact thing they already did first, so that's it? Pause. You're abandoning your family? Interesting thing about toxic parents. They almost always accuse you of the exact thing they already did first. Conference room B went completely silent after my mother said it. Not emotional silence. Strategic silence. The kind people use while waiting to see whether guilt still works. Interesting, honestly. Because manipulative families don't stop pushing until they confirm the old buttons no longer function. I looked at Margaret Offit carefully across the conference table. Same cardigan. Same perfect posture. Same woman who stood beside a notary 7 years earlier and announced publicly that I was no longer her daughter. And honestly? For the first time in my life. She looked old to me. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just tired. Interesting thing about healing. Eventually the people who controlled your childhood stop looking emotionally gigantic. You already abandoned me. Simple sentence. No raised voice. No anger. And somehow that made it land harder. Margaret blinked once slowly. Then immediately. That was different. Interesting phrase. Because people who harm others almost always invent exceptions protecting themselves morally. You took my inheritance. Silence. You publicly disowned me. Another silence. You never apologized. My father lowered his head further after that. Like every sentence physically added weight to his spine. Interesting, honestly. Because guilt eventually becomes visible on people who carry it long enough. Margaret folded her hands tightly. You have money now. There it was. The real belief underneath everything. Success erased injury. Interesting thing about emotionally exploitative parents. They think your healing cancels their behavior retroactively. You're a partner at a DC firm. You own property. You vacation in Europe. Pause. You'll survive. I almost laughed. Not because anything felt funny. Because suddenly the entire philosophy became visible. Survival. That was the standard. Not fairness. Not love. Not accountability. Just survival. Interesting, honestly. Because children raised in dysfunction often get praised only after proving they survived damage nobody should have caused. I opened my desk calendar slowly. Removed one folded sheet from the back pocket. And slid it across the table. Toward my mother. Toward the woman who thought this meeting was about rescuing her financially. Interesting thing about preparation. Real power stays quiet until documentation enters the room. Margaret frowned slightly. Then unfolded the paper. Foreclosure timeline. Trust withdrawal summary. Property transfer records. And attached beneath all of it. A formal civil complaint draft. Prepared. And signed. Ready. Phil stared at it immediately like he'd just seen a loaded weapon placed on the table. Margaret's face drained slowly. Not dramatically. Systematically. Interesting, honestly. Because people who manipulate emotionally rarely expect preparation legally. You investigated us? No. I documented you. Huge difference. The statute limitations on several withdrawals expired. Pause. But not all. Another pause. And fraud involving fiduciary concealment extends exposure significantly. Attorney voice now. Cold. Precise. The voice I built from 7 years of surviving people exactly like them. Interesting thing about becoming powerful after trauma. Eventually the skills you develop to survive become the exact skills that protect you later. Phil whispered first. Oh God. Margaret kept reading silently. Line after line. Dates. Amounts. Bank routing numbers. Trust language. Evidence. Real evidence. Not family storytelling. Not rewritten memory. Objective truth. Interesting honestly. Because manipulative people depend heavily on the idea that nobody will ever organize the timeline properly. Finally. Very quietly. My mother asked. You'd sue us? Interesting question. Because somehow stealing from your daughter felt less shocking to her than consequences. I prepared in case you came back demanding more. Silence. Huge silence. Because deep down, she realized something devastating. I knew her completely. Interesting thing about healing from narcissistic parents. Eventually their patterns become predictable instead of powerful. Phil looked physically ill now. Hands trembling hard enough to shake the paperwork. I told you this would happen. Margaret turned toward him sharply. No, you didn't. Yes. Quiet voice. Weak voice. But honest. Interesting honestly. Because truth usually arrives softly after years of silence. I told you Walter knew. Pause. I told you Tony would find everything eventually. Margaret stood abruptly again. Chair scraping hard across hardwood. She's threatening us. No. I stood too. Slowly. Calmly. I'm protecting myself. Huge difference. Because boundaries sound like attacks to people accustomed to unlimited access. The room stayed still for several seconds. Late sunlight fading against the glass walls. Washington traffic glowing far below us. My parents standing in the office their stolen money indirectly helped create. Interesting honestly. Because irony becomes almost unbearable once consequences finally arrive. Then my father did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket. Removed a small velvet pouch. And slid it toward me across the table. My pocket watch. Walter's Hamilton. The real one. I froze immediately. Interesting thing about grief. Certain objects reopen entire decades emotionally. I took it after the funeral, Phil whispered. Pause. Your mother wanted it sold. Margaret looked horrified. Not because he admitted it. Because he returned it. Interesting honestly. Because controlling people understand symbolic rebellion instantly. Phil pushed the pouch closer toward me. I should have given it back years ago. I opened the velvet carefully. Silver casing. Hairline scratch near the hinge. Warm from his pocket. Exactly the same. Make it count. Still engraved inside. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because of the watch. Because for the first time, my father had finally chosen something over my mother's approval. Late. Painfully late. But real. Interesting thing about broken families. Sometimes healing begins decades after the damage because one person finally stops cooperating with the lie. Margaret sat back down slowly. Smaller now. Not defeated exactly. Just exposed. Then quietly. What happens now? Interesting honestly. Because accountability terrifies people once manipulation stops working. I looked at both of them carefully. Then answered truthfully. You lose the lake house. Silence. You sell the Asheville property. Another silence. You live within your actual means for the first time in 20 years. Margaret's eyes filled again. Real tears this time. Not strategic. Human. Huge difference. And thus? There it was. Not money. Not the house. The real question finally arriving 7 years late. Interesting thing about consequences. Eventually people realized the emotional loss mattered more than the financial one. I held Walter's watch tightly in my hand. Felt the weight of it settle against my palm. Then answered carefully. I don't know yet. Honest answer. Maybe the first honest answer our family ever exchanged without manipulation attached to it. Nadia knocked softly 10 minutes later to say security was locking the lower lobby. My parents gathered their paperwork quietly. No screaming. No dramatic collapse. Just reality. Heavy reality. Interesting honestly. Because the end of toxic family systems usually sounds less like explosions and more like exhausted people finally running out of lies. Phil paused beside the conference room door before leaving. Then looked back once. You became exactly who Walter hoped. And honestly? That healed more than the money ever could.